So I think we'll go ahead and start in the interest of time, everybody's time all over the world. My name is Tom Fleischner. I'm the executive director of the Natural History Institute, which is based, it's a mission-based independent nonprofit organization based here in Prescott, Arizona, which is in the Mogollon Highlands ecoregion. And it's my great pleasure and honor to be the host of this evening's event. As I said, the Institute is a mission-driven organization, and our mission is to provide leadership and resources for a revitalized practice of natural history that integrates art, science, and humanities to promote the health and well-being of humans and the rest of the natural world. So a big mission for a small but mighty organization, and we'll be talking more about what we mean by natural history and so on down the line. But essentially we try to foster love and understanding of the world, help people fall in love with the world. I would invite you to, if you haven't already done so, to check out our website, which is just naturalhistoryinstitute.org, and there's a lot of great resources and information on there. I want to draw your attention to a couple things in particular. One is that we have a YouTube channel, which this presentation and many, many others will be archived there, and you can subscribe to that channel and know when we have new stuff on there. There's tabs for all these things right on the top of the homepage. Also, given that I know we have a lot of writers in the crowd tonight, I wanted to bring your attention to a special project we've had this year during the pandemic called the Real Ground Initiative, which is an opportunity to share your perspectives on what you're bearing witness to in your part of the world. Also, there's, like all small nonprofits, we depend on the generosity of the people who value our programs and would invite you to consider supporting us, which is also an easy tab to do that. So that said, I'd like to welcome all of you to our Natural History Institute community and hope that you'll join us for other events as well. This evening's program, we have several wonderful co-sponsors as well. One is the wonderful project called Poets for Science, which Jane initiated. We'll talk a little bit more about that down the line. And the Wick Poetry Center of Kent State University, which has also been very involved in Poets for Science, as well as our good friends and allies around the corner here in Arizona. The Peregrine Book Company is a sponsor of the event, and they, if you're looking to buy some of Jane's books, you can do that through peregrinebookcompany.com, or for those of you in the US, their phone number is 928-445-9000. That's 928-445-9000, peregrinebookcompany.com. So just a couple things I want to say about the Zoom protocols, and then what to expect here tonight, and then get to introduce our wonderful guest of honor. So I know many of us live our lives to a large extent on Zoom these days, but it happens in some different ways in different settings. So we have been inviting people to say hello on the chat function, but momentarily here we are going to turn that function off because it gets distracting during the main presentation, but instead we will be using the Q&A function, which is down on the lower right of the at the bottom of the screen. And if as we're talking along and as Jane is reading poems and whatnot, if you begin to have questions that you'd like to ask her, then you can add those there, and later on in the program we will get to some of those questions, probably just a handful of the questions. But also on that Q&A function there is a thumbs up function. So if you see that somebody else has asked what you are very close to what you're interested in, if you can just go ahead and do that, and then it shows that there's a lot of interest in that one and not have a whole nother line. So, and as I alluded to a little bit before, we do have, the Institute has a YouTube channel, and this is being simultaneously live streamed there with many people watching there. Welcome to all of you. And for those of you who want to check it out again later or to tell somebody else about it who wasn't able to be here with us this evening, that will be up on that channel about within 24 hours. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jane Hirshfield, who's obviously her fame has preceded her. Jane, just to mention a few highlights, Jane is the author of 9 books of poetry, most recently Ledger, right here, which just came out earlier this year, or I guess last year, and also a couple classic collections of essays, one that has been particularly important to me, this one here, 9 Gates, Entering the Mind of Poetry, and also book 10 Windows, How Great Poems Transform the World. So Jane has played a really important role both as a poet and as one who helps the world understand poetry. We'll be delving into that momentarily. She's the recipient of a great many awards, including, among others, the Poetry Center Book Award, the California Book Award, and she's been longlisted for the National Book Award. Her poems appear in many, many high-profile journals, including the New Yorker, Atlantic, Harper's, the New York Times, and many others. 10 different times, Jane's poems have been included in the Best American Poetry anthology. And she's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and also a former chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. One other thing that is relevant to our conversation here this evening, and certainly has been relevant to Jane's path, is that she was involved in rigorous training in Zen Buddhism earlier in her life, and that has informed much of her work, and we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. And last but not least, at least to me, is that I'm very happy to say that Jane is a member of the Natural History Institute's Advisory Council. So thank you for that service, Jane. A reviewer recently referred to Jane with a phrase that I really like, which is that she's one of the most unboastfully courageous voices of our time. So we are happy to, I'll give it to you later. So we're happy to have this, and I just thought that really kind of nailed it. So what will be happening here this evening is that Jane and I will, for most of the time, Jane and I will just be having a conversation, sort of a conversation among friends with overlapping interests. And what we want to explore primarily is the relationship between the practice of natural history, the practice of poetry, and Zen practice, all of which really are, in one way or another, the practice of attentiveness. And we want to sort of probe around and see if we can see those kind of connections. And then also, how do all of these practices connect with the energy or the presence that we refer to as the wild or wildness, and what does that mean? And this is called Poetry and the Wild, so we'll try to tie in that too. And throughout, Jane will be sharing poems, sort of like temple bells, or bringing us to attention and to elucidate certain points perhaps. And then, as I say, we'll get at some point to some of your questions for Jane, and we'll do our best to respond to some of those. I apologize to those of you who are watching on the YouTube live stream. We can't access that, but thank you for your understanding of that. So one thing I wanted to just say I suspect for many people watching here tonight, the term natural history may be vague or may just conjure up an image of a museum you visited on a field trip or something like that. And so what does this really mean in the context of this discussion here tonight? The term natural history actually originally in Latin, Historia Naturalis, really translates as the story of nature. So we're be talking about stories of nature. Our definition that we function with the Natural History Institute here is as a practice of intentional, focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. So when we're talking about natural history, that's the approach that we'll be taking. So I've been talking plenty. So Jane, welcome. It's so wonderful to have you here tonight. Thank you for making this time to be with us. And I was hoping you might be able to start us off with a poem as sort of an invocation for the evening.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. And I just have to, before I read the poem, I just have to say, let us all celebrate the landing on Mars of Perseverance rover successfully earlier today. Natural history is about to happen in a perhaps observable, immediate way if those rocks end up coming home like they're supposed to on a new planet as of today. And that's pretty amazing. Okay, so having invoked Mars, I will now invoke my next door neighbors, the immediate natural history of my own place in the world. I'm going to start with a poem titled Today, Another Universe, because one of the things that both natural history and poetry and also Zen clarify for us is that any inch of ground is a universe. Any inch of ground is continuous with the larger universe, and the practice of observation begins here. So my neighbors had a pine tree, beautiful old pine tree. It was leaning. New people moved in the lot below, and they were told by their insurance company, we won't insure your house as long as that tree is there. So the poem. Today, another universe. The arborist has determined senescence, beetles, canker, quickened by drought, but in any case, not prunable, not treatable, not to be propped. And so, the branch from which the sharp-shinned hawks and their mate cries, the trunk where the ant, the red squirrel's 80-foot playground, the bark, cambium, pine sap, cluster of needles, the Japanese patterns, the ink net, the dapple on certain fish. Today, for some, a universe will vanish, first noisily, then just another silence, the silence of after, once the theater has emptied, of bewilderment after the glacier, the species, the star. Something else in the scale of quickening things will replace it. This whole of light in the light, the puzzled birds swerving around it. And that's pretty much how it goes with some poems. Anyhow, you begin with an intimate and personal loss, and you observe that, and you think about all of the interconnections that accrue to that one great tree which had lived for a long time, probably since well before the houses were here. And then the next thing you know, you're thinking about the crisis of the biosphere and the glaciers. And what would it be if this gorgeous earthly theater were in fact emptied and silent? Mm. So, the whole book has the crisis of climate and biosphere and of social justice running through it like a vein of ore. At its center, there are other subjects, but I wanted to start with that poem because it touches on so many of the aspects of what I think our conversation tonight is going to go to.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, it's a lovely example of this idea of the more than human world, the human experience embedded within this larger tapestry of life, and how the boundary between them is very thin if it exists at all. So I thought, Jane, that we'd sort of talk a little bit about the role of poetry in our world, then talk a little bit about natural history, and then about your perspectives on how Buddhism connects with those, and then we'll try to see how those all connect as much as we can. So to start then, why poetry? In this moment in the world, what is the real work of poetry for us in our world today. And this is something you've written about eloquently. For example, in Nine Gates, it was fun going back to my heavily underlined copy in the last couple of weeks, and literally the very first sentence in the book, you say, poetry's work is the clarification and magnification of being, which is a wonderful statement. I'd like to see if we could burrow into that a little more deeply or a little more specifically, like how at this moment, when there's so many challenges in the world, how does poetry help us?
Mm. So I think poetry is, every art form, every science is its own unique technology of discovery. And perhaps the work that poetry in particular does, not all poems, not always, there's never only one understanding of anything. But poetry is a matter of thinking and understanding with the whole body, with every possible form of relationship being brought together into a single momentary, as Robert Frost so wonderfully put it, stay against confusion. And so, I have the intention of discovery. Discovery is what I want when I write a poem, when I read a poem. I want to be left changed. If the poem is good, whether in a small way or in a large way, I am a different human being for having made the journey through that particular constellation of words and seeing and imagination and music and understanding. And so, for me, I suppose pretty primary in my relationship with poetry from childhood has been that a poem is a way of finding wholeness amidst the broken, of finding a momentary pause of rest and understanding amidst the incomprehensible. You don't need a poem to recount to you what you already know. You need a poem to engage with what feels overwhelming, incomprehensible, bewildering, painful, beyond understanding. And the poem gives you a way to take the next breath, to open your eyes again the next morning when even the unbearable has happened. Sometimes it's smaller than the unbearable. Sometimes it's just a matter of a curiosity has been raised. But for me, every poem is answering a question whose only answer is that particular poem. And so, now more than ever, there are so many ways we are in need of an assistance towards a sense of resilience. The pandemic, the political chaos we have gone through, the large abiding crises of social justice and of climate justice and of living with this sense of incredible precariousness. Will we be here in 500 years? What kind of world will our children be in 50 years, in 15 years? Here we are. And there are so many forms of assistance that are needed. And one of the ones that can help when all of the others are resting, when the engineers are resting and the historians are resting and the musicians are between sets getting a beer at the bar, maybe that's when you turn to a poem to get you through the next 5 minutes and come out of it feeling restored to a kind of wholeness, even if you can't explain it. Is that something of an answer for you?
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. One thing that really struck me in what you just said is when you said that poetry, we experience it in our bodies. And I think that's counterintuitive for some people. I think some people have the impression that poetry is this very cerebral, just from the neck up kind of experience, and that which I don't think is true, because certainly moves us in a very emotional ways, which is not just a cerebral experience, but I like how explicit you are about that. So that's wonderful. So
could I ask you in turn, why natural history? We might as well let you bring the answer to your own question into the conversation. Why natural history?
Very good. Great. Well, in maybe because some people were still streaming in when I read the definition earlier, let me again say what our sort of working definition of natural history is here, which is a practice of intentional, focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. Or as I've recently give a lot of talks about why natural history matters and so on, and I've more recently taken to just describing natural history as the practice of falling in love with the world. And I think that that's part of the answer to the question then is why it matters but there's a number and so I guess I would say that natural history in the way that we think of it here is I would say that natural history is a verb, not a noun. I think a lot of times people think of natural history as just a bunch of dead birds in a drawer or dioramas at a museum or what have you, and it's not a living, breathing thing. And I think that actually the natural history is about the practice of attentiveness, and it is how we connect very, very deeply with the world around us, and only by doing that can we then care for it and we feel better. So one reason that it makes us that it's important, why natural history is on the selfish level, is I think we feel better when we feel connected to the web of life around us, and it helps us. The same kind of things you were saying about poetry very closely in terms of resilience and nurturing those kind of deeper feelings. And I would mention that I don't think I've ever told you this, Jane, but when I was first sort of conjuring up that definition that I've just shared a couple decades ago, some of your writings actually were very much in the mix of my thinking. And I went back recently and I noticed that the first paper I ever wrote that shared that, I also quoted some of your work from Nine Gates actually about concentration and awareness and so on. And similarly, for many years, I taught a field course called Natural History and Ecology of the Southwest. And for quite a few years, I had a quote from you actually at the top, as like the inscription at the top of the syllabus, which was, everything changes, everything is connected, pay attention. I thought that was like, and you put that forth in an interview I read somewhere years ago as a kind of a summary of the primary teachings of Zen. And I thought it was a great summary of the teachings of natural history and ecology as well. So
you've never told me any of this. I'm
yeah,
stunned, and I'm very happy to have been of service.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So with that, more sort of the definition that I've shared is certainly more expansive of a definition than many people think of that. Sometimes it's just thought of sort of a subset of science or what have you, but I think it's actually something much larger than science. And so with that kind of definition in mind of the practice of attentiveness, and we've started already get into this, but anything else come to your mind as far as the relationship between the practice of natural history, as we're talking about here, and the practice of poetry? How anything else come to your mind about similarities, or for that matter, differences between the two?
So, the similarities, and you've already brought in the awareness of Zen, so let's include that as well.
Yeah.
I think the similarity is that each of these practices, meditation practice or the mindfulness practice of the Vipassana schools of Buddhism, and natural history, poetry, all of these are about the expansion of awareness, which awareness is both our birthright gift and something that can be trained. And the increase of the ability to notice things, I think, is one of the deepest pleasures of our human experienced life. And you alluded also to something which made me think immediately of a Robinson Jeffers quote, one of our earliest, explicitly environmental poets. He talked about falling in love outward.
Mhm.
And I think both the falling in love and the outwardness quite matter in terms of this experience of shivering delight and wholeness that the practice of anything with your entire body and mind can lead you to. When you fall into what you are observing, for me, these are the happiest moments of my life, when my life actually disappears, when the narrow worries of the day-to-day self of oh, do I have to, oh, have I remembered, oh, have I, and then when you can give yourself completely to anything you love, which might be the observation of a lizard and the colors on that lizard bodies, and it might be the making of a poem which has arisen in response to having seen that lizard, or it might be the open, expansive concentration of Zen practice. When the self disappears, the self is the most happy, because we are permeable, then we're everything. But we're everything through some very particular portal. Generalization is not the road to this particular form of
Right.
happiness. Only the instantiation of this moment, and whatever this moment carries us into and toward, that's where the gate is. You need a doorknob. You can't walk through everything. But when you walk through anything and suddenly have this gorgeous experience of falling into that, or falling into this, falling into here, that's where all of these things, I think, become one continuous practice, one continuous fabric of experience. The differences between them, I think, poetry is particularly about the integration of objective and subjective, outer and inner, your whole history, you're thinking with your whole body, and you're knowing with your entire history on this earth, everything that has ever happened to you, everything you have ever read about, they come into the poem. And so it is perhaps of these three practices. Now, I don't want to say that any of this is left out of natural history or left out of practice, because it isn't. I mean, these are false distinctions, and what these paths give us is a chance to recognize that they are false distinctions, that inner and outer are actually continuous, that objective and subjective are not separable. But we, in each of these paths, we are beings, we human beings are constellated in such a way that we look in the direction of our vision. So what you intend to see is going to be what you do see. And then every once in a while, some large tsunami wave of experience will come along, and then you'll just see what the world has caused you to see, because you are tumbling in the tsunami of what has been given you. And that too, however hard it is an expansion of experience. The people in Texas now who are in the grip of something larger than they are, it's called winter. An unexpected polar vortex has come in and upended everything. That is very difficult in the moment, but if you survive it, it becomes your most treasured memory. And it becomes something that might come into a poem. And it becomes something that you practice with if you are a person of any spiritual practice, not just Zen. And so, these are different intentions of seeing, but they are all intentions of seeing, and eventually they share a taproot, perhaps.
Yeah. I want to ask one follow-up question, and then maybe we could hear a couple more poems if you're so inclined. And I also wanted to remind people that are on the Zoom part of this platform that if you would like to pose any questions for Jane at any time, you can do that through the Q&A little function at the bottom right of the screen, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I just wanted to think a little bit more, and you were talking about the vision and so on, and I was just wondering if you could say anything about for you, how does the actual practice of attentiveness work? Like, do you set aside certain times to, like, I'm just going to go see what's out there? Do you just let your attention be drawn by what, the tree that you described, in the first poem? Probably some combination of all these things. Is there ever a goal that you're looking for? And all these same questions could, of course, be asked of natural history as well. But any thoughts about that?
So I suppose a life goal for me has, again, since childhood, has been, simply because of the way my own psyche is made, to find the spaciousness that allows a changed and more permeable attention to step forward. And that often for me, because I'm an introvert rather than an extrovert, it often for me has to do with a space of non-distraction, the feeling that I won't be bumped into or interrupted or my door be knocked on. And when I can find that, the interior analog to what I'm describing in rather outer ways, then things come into my attention differently, in a way which is more less determined and more magnetized by curiosity. So things, I once was working in at an artist retreat, and artist retreats allow me, as the Zen monastery allowed me, as the practice of natural history allows people who go out into the field and sit for 8 hours simply looking at what is around you, you begin to see and hear and feel differently. You are more open to connections. So at this artist colony, every single day at the end of the day, I was going out and doing a loop, a 1.25 mile loop. Sometimes I would do it as much as 4 times. And that was my aerobics, because you don't move very much when you're working at a desk all day. And I needed at the end of the day to get out into the world. And somewhere around the 3rd week, I suddenly noticed there was a path hole next to the path I was taking. There was this little hole in the ground, maybe there were 3 of them, and I suddenly went, oh, something lives there. And I saw it differently. Now, if I had been practicing natural history, I would have sat down to figure out who lives in the hole. But because I was practicing as a poet that month, it instead became a poem. Simply, the existence of a small hole by the path side. So let me find where on this large list of poems, I can't even remember which book it was in. Can I find it? I thought I wrote it down here somewhere. I didn't. Okay, well, let's just say there became a poem called, A Small Hole by the Path Side That Something Lives In. And that became a way to think and feel about the mysterious, unconscious underground life that is always conducting itself through us. I mean, I could take some time and find the poem, but one, just as with radio, one doesn't like a great deal of silence during Zoom time, and I don't seem to have put it on the list, which is silly of me. But since it's time, I think, to hear another poem or two, I will give you a different poem from from an artist colony experience. So one of the things I was thinking about as I was looking for what we might be talking about, even though I'm just here to answer questions and not initiate things, I was thinking about sometimes I write poems and they cause me to wonder about the natural history behind what I've observed.
Mm.
So this is a poem that came, I was living in a house that had a kitchen in it, and somebody else, another artist who was there, a composer and writer, he was gathering edible wild mushrooms and delivering them to the kitchen to be part of dinner. And one day I walked into the totally empty kitchen of this house, and it was completely redolent with the mushrooms that he had gathered and cleaned before taking them to another building where the actual cooking was being done. And it made me wonder, you know, I became a person, sort of Miss Marple's crossed with a truffle pig. I had never understood how strongly scented mushrooms actually are. And it led to one line in here that I will get to about, do they want to be found? You know, do mushrooms, are they putting out this scent because is it good for mushrooms to be eaten? Otherwise, you know, otherwise they would be cryptic. They wouldn't have a scent if it wasn't doing it. So that was my natural history question, which I never
Absolutely.
answered. Maybe you can, but here's the poem that came out of that, which does go other directions besides this small natural history speculation in the middle of it. In a kitchen where mushrooms were washed. In a kitchen where mushrooms were washed, the mushroom scent lingers. As the sea must keep for a long time the scent of the whale. As a person who's once loved completely, a country once conquered, does not release that stunned knowledge. They must want to be found, those strange shaped rising morels, clownish puffballs. Lichens have served as a lamp wick, clean burning coconuts, olives, dried salmon, sheep fat, a carcass of petrol set blazing, light that is fume and abradement. Unburnable mushrooms are other. They darken the air they come into. There's the scent of having been traveled, been taken. So tell me, Tom, does it, I know that the life of mushrooms is mostly the underground mycelial mats, and this is just the fruiting body that we gather, but does it serve them in terms of evolutionary survival, that they put forth such a noticeable scent that draws certain mammals to go for them? Do you know?
It's a great question. You're basically posing hypotheses through your poems.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, which is really the same thing that a naturalist does when they go out, and then sometimes will plop themselves down and spend 3 or 4 years trying to, you know, methodically answer that question. As it happens, I don't know a whole lot about fungi, but I know that in some cases, for sure, there's dispersal of spores and so on, but I have no idea in the particular case that you're looking at. But it's a great example of using the practice of poetry, well, basically where the practice of poetry and the practice of natural history are completely aligned.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. You don't always have to answer the question, but it's really fun to come up with one. I have a different poem I won't read you that um, holds in it a speculation which a friend of mine who also she works with squirrels, she works with olfaction. I should ask her about the mushroom business. She said, when I told her this hypothesis of mine, she said, oh yes, so-and-so wrote a paper about that. So the hypothesis that appears as a line in another poem is, our eyes find shining beautiful because it reminds us of water. So, why do we like diamonds? Why do we like shiny things? Because in the natural world, something that is shiny is either wet or has been smoothed by water, or perhaps contains oils in its leaves, which holds water in a dry climate. And so for our ancient mammalian eyes, of course, we're drawn to shiny things, because a shiny thing often means water source. And we need to know where the water source is. So again, just a poet's speculation, but I was thrilled when my friend said, oh yes, there's a whole paper that follows up on this idea that I just came to, because when you're writing poems, you are thinking in multidimensional ways. And for me, that was a really interesting idea to have come up with. Why are shiny things beautiful? Well, let's think about that as a poet. And then it turns out maybe a natural historian is thinking about it from the more scientific direction.
That's great. That comes back to what you said earlier about poetry being a process of discovery. So yeah, wonderful. Is there any other poem that you'd like to read right now, or?
Well, it occurred to me, I have so many poems I would like to read, and we won't have time for almost any of them. But it occurred to me, for our audience, which is, some mix, and we don't know which, of practitioners primarily of natural history and practitioners primarily of poetry, it occurred to me maybe they'd like to be sent home with a suggestion for how can I use natural history in my life as a writer, or how can I expand my practice of natural history by writing a poem. And I found I found a little set of poems that all seem to, they begin with an outer observation and then respond with something from the life of the understanding of the psyche, of the emotions. And sometimes that outer thing is seen, and sometimes it is a piece of knowledge from natural history. And so I'm going to give you, I don't know, I won't read all of them, but maybe a couple of those, so you can get the hang of how, for me, does it work, this looking outward and responding from the interior, having an observation, and then bringing to it, rather than the next question of how does the science of it work, science being, of course, just another word for knowing, but how can you use it to magnetize the inner life into coming to a question, a perception, a changed understanding. So here are two that are right next to each other in the book, Come Thief. And so I'll read you those because it's easy. The first one, Something I Saw. Green striped melons. They lie under stars in a field. They lie under rain in a field, under sun. Some people are like this as well, like a painting hidden beneath another painting, an unexpected weight, the sign of their ripeness. And so, when you're when you're growing melons, how do you know when it's ripe? Some of it is the change of color, but some of it is the change of weight. And it's hidden. It's right there in front of you, and it's also hidden. And this is something that, I'm very interested in. There's a whole chapter in 10 Windows about hiddenness in poetry. And this next one, this is not something that I had seen, but something that I had read. China. Whales follow the whale roads, geese, roads of magnetized air. To go great distance, exactitudes matter. Yet how often the heart that set out for Peru arrives in China, steering hard, consulting the charts the whole journey. So again, the whale roads actually do exist, and we think that it's a matter of scent, I believe. And then, the speculation about birds navigating by a little organ inside of their beak that actually knows the magnetic fields of the earth. And then I just moved to thinking about, well, how do we navigate in our human lives? And the answer is pretty badly, because we don't know, can't know where we're going to end up. We think we've set out for one destination, we land somewhere completely different, but isn't it wonderful? And so, beginning with the facts of animal navigation and then going to the question of what do you do when you're totally lost in your life? These are connected. So that's a way, if any of you want to try writing a poem later, go ahead and look outward, see something, notice something, take a piece of natural history and then just see what gets summoned onto the page from starting with that and then throwing the field wide open. Just see what might come in and what part of your own life might get magnified or clarified or just called into the room to be looked at.
That's great. I used to teach a course, co-teach it with a psychologist friend called Nature and Psyche. And so it's kind of bringing together natural history, ecology, and psychology. And we use natural history as sort of the unifying metaphor for the class. And that you could look outwardly in the ways that we normally think of natural history, but you could also have that attentiveness to what is going on in that inner life. So essentially the natural history of emotions. And so in that way, it's all sort of one natural history. So, yeah, but that is sort of made lucid by the practice of poetry in this case.
I wish I could have been your student in that course.
I wish that too. So I just want to ask you a couple more questions, and then we have a lot of good stuff kind of coming into the Q&A here. I want to try to get some other voices into the conversation. So we've talked before about, the state of politics, the state of, has sometimes gone horribly awry, etc. And so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share about how the practice of poetry, but for that matter, the practice of natural history, the practice of Buddhism, all these things we're seeing are very much aligned. How do any of these practices kind of help us engage with the world of human decision making, the world of, the quote unquote real world, which is of course only part of the real world, but still it matters. And so what's the role of a poet in the realm of human decision making? Or naturalist, or Buddhist, or what have you.
I love that question, because these are three fields which have, traditionally sometimes been, each of them might be thought of as turning away from political engagement. And each of them is profoundly able to be a path to political engagement. How could we do any of the activism of climate change, of 350.org, of Greta Thunberg, without having the facts which are assembled for us by the natural historians, by the people who are simply looking and seeing the disappearance of the ice, which has been visible to us. Rachel Carson wrote about it in 1949, wrote about disappearing ice. This is not new knowledge, but it is knowledge we need to be exposed to repeatedly again and again until finally we hear it. Poems also are a way that we hear it, that we hear the urgency, that we allow in the grief of it. Because after all, one of the ways, how do we human beings decide what is to be acted upon? What matters to us enough to change our lives? And the news of that is sometimes brought to us from the newspaper. It is often brought to us by the photographers, by the dramatists, by the novelists, by the painters, by the scientific paper translated by those marvelous science journalists and given to the rest of us in the New York Times and the Washington Post and online. But also the poets are the ones who are charged with transmitting both the love and the urgency of the crisis. And, Buddhism, which is so often thought of as going off somewhere to meditate and being separate from the world, there is a long and very honorable tradition of engaged Buddhism, as it is specifically called, where, the monks are out there on the street in their robes at a peace march, at a Black Lives Matter march, at a climate march. And so for me, there's also another direction of it, which is when I am so undone by the news, writing the poem is what allows me to kind of reassemble my fractured psyche and go on to do something. So I can give you, if you want, the poem that led to the founding of Poets for Science.
Wonderful.
So it's kind of a, circle on circle. So
And
as
then I want to have you to tell everybody about a little bit about Poets for Science, because I mentioned it before, but a lot of people may
probably
not be aware.
this. I can do it in the introducing of the poem. So there's a poem in Ledger called "On the Fifth Day," and some of us will grievously remember on the fifth day of the administration that entered the White House in 2017, that was the day that all information about climate change was taken down from the website, and every scientist who worked for the federal government was directed not to speak about their research in public unless it was pre-vetted by the politically appointed new heads of their agency. So absolutely, from the very beginning of that administration straight through to the debacle that we have seen unfold through to its last day and beyond, there was this anti-science, I don't even know what noun to attach to that adjective. So on that day, I have, for 25 years, many of my closest friends have been research scientists, and that silencing of the scientists felt to me exactly as intimate and personal as the silencing of poets would have been. And by the end of the day, I wrote this poem. I'll read it to you, and then I'll talk a little more about what it led to. On the fifth day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air, and the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. Bound to gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke the fifth day of silence. So I wrote the poem. I sent it to 3 of my scientist friends. They immediately came back and said, can we send this to other people? And within a few days, I was getting word back from, people from Florida, from Minnesota, gratitude that the poet had cared about what had happened to them. And this changes you when you hear that the scientists are grateful to be known and recognized by a poem. That shifts something in you. And so when the March for Science, which was basically set going by these same events and outrage of these same events, as soon as it hit the public radar, and I knew it was happening. You know how they put out on the website, little things saying, if you'd like to volunteer at the March for Science, let us know. And so I went to the website and I said, well, yeah, I'd kind of like to volunteer. I have some ideas about how poetry might be part of the March for Science. And from that email, and I gave them 6 or 7 possibilities. And I said, you could do this, you could do that, you could have this, you could have that. And they took 6 of the 7. And one of the ideas was, I said, look, if you like this, I happen to have a poem and I'd be happy to read it. And so when the first March for Science happened in Washington, DC, not too long after all of this, I read the poem to 40 or 50,000 people. The poem was published in the Washington Post the weekend before. And so it was also, as it turned out, read at the March for Science in Dublin by the former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson. It was read in Paris, it was read in Marseille, it was read in Frankfurt, it was read in Seattle. And meanwhile, Poets for Science got born because of all those other ideas. And so there was a tent on the Washington Mall at the Teach-In for the rally before the march, absolutely covered with life-size banners of science poems that I had collected. The Wick Poetry Center of Kent State had come in to help me with the physical part of this, like having a tent. That's not something I know how to do. Printing the banners, not really something I know how to do. We got local Washington, DC poets who were interested in science to offer writing workshops in the tent for both children and adults beforehand. They made placards with lines from poems to be carried as signs during the march. And that turned out to have a continuing life. The banners went immediately to New York City, where some of them were displayed at Pioneer Works at an event of the Universe in Verse that was held there. Most recently, before everything shut down, the last place those banners traveled, and they have been a number of places between, including at the Natural History Institute in Prescott, they were at Vanderbilt University in spring of 2020, co-sponsored by the science department there. So I believe they were displayed in the engineering building. And this just gives me all kinds of happiness to think of science poems on display, in the engineering building in Nashville at Vanderbilt University, because we want to speak to everyone. Poets don't want to just talk to people who think they're interested in poetry. We want to talk with the scientists and the engineers and the doctors and the physicists and the astrophysicists and the biologists and the molecular biologists and the makers of MRI machines. And all these things are touched on in various of the poems that we made the banners out of. And, the mathematicians. And it turns out, once you start talking to people, that there are a lot of mathematicians in this world who read a poem over breakfast with their spouse every morning. It's quite the thing.
It's a wonderful project. I highly recommend people check it out online. You can see all these poems, and it's been, as you mentioned, they've been here, and actually we were able to keep a few of the banners here, including the poem that you just read is in our lobby right below my office here. So it's been a wonderful sort of charge to the work that we do here. So thank you for that. And it strikes me that your story that you just shared about that is another part of the answer to the question we were just grappling with a couple minutes ago, which is about the role of poetry in human forums and decision making and so on, because somehow the poetry got through on a sort of visceral kind of level in ways that more data couldn't. So that's wonderful. So I want to, we're running a little bit short of time, and I want to try to pull in some of the questions that have been coming in from our international audience here, and share a few of these. I apologize in advance, folks. We won't be able to get to nearly all of them, but to share a few things to be able to let you deal with a few of these, and then we'll kind of come back and in closure we'll hear some another poem or two, hopefully. Okay, so Leah Barnett, hello Leah, and several other people agreed, said, thank you so much for speaking to the embodiment of reading poetry. I feel like the felt experience is one that's retreating farther and farther into the background of human doing as opposed to human being. How can we as poets, natural historians, and others who feel the wild so deeply be ambassadors for putting the brain back in the body, back in the world?
That is a marvelous question, and it is perhaps almost its own answer, which is simply to do so, to do the speaking, to bring forward. I remember, so there's an organization called it's something like the Society for the Study of Literature and the Environment, and it's worldwide. The Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. And there are branches in many countries, and there are meetings in many countries. And I was on a panel at one that was held at UC Davis, again, pre-pandemic, so an in-person panel. And one of the people in the audience, and it happened to be the last event of the entire conference. And one of the people in the audience had a question, and he raised his hand and he said, I work for NASA down the road, and we're all working on these issues. We all know, the facts of climate change. We see the evidence of what is happening, but nobody ever talks about the grief of it. None of my fellow people, we're always, scientific, factual. You said, what I've loved so much about this conference and about this panel is it brought forward the grief of it. And so all I can say is, yes, speak of it. Maybe send your coworkers a poem, or pin it up on the inside of the lavatory door, which is something they do in hospitals in England quite a bit. They call it poetry in the loos. Bring it in, because it is, I think this is something I was starting to say earlier and never finished the thought of. The only way we know to act is by the emotional valence within us in response to something.
Mm,
How do we know we care enough to change our lives to do something that brings us no personal gain but must be done? Well, we know it because we feel emotional outrage, or we feel grief,
mhm,
or we feel
mm,
love. And on behalf of that love, we must speak for what we love, the preservation of the wild, which
mhm,
no one who experiences the wild is you know the experience of awe of being in the beyond human world. I once slept inside the hollowed out, burned out bottom of a redwood tree, and what I learned from
mm,
that is all night it moved, it swayed in the wind, and I could hear this enormous being that was my shelter also swaying. That was awesome. And I think all of these emotions are necessary for us to know what to do. And they are embodied emotions, they are felt emotions. And so, how do you bring it forward into the world? You just do. You just say the thing,
mhm. Right.
share the poem, send the photograph around, cultivate awe in self and sharing
Cultivate,
with others.
cultivate. Oh, I like that. And sort of challenge shyness within ourselves in a way, like as you say,
Yeah.
just do it. Yeah, yeah.
It's
Thank you.
exposing, we make ourselves
Yeah, yeah,
vulnerable when we bring our emotions into the room. Um, have
yeah.
courage.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a question here about sort of a craft question. Um, do you keep a poetry journal where you write fragments or a few lines? And if so, then how do you work with that, with it, the
Um,
material?
so many people do. That doesn't happen to be how I work. How I work tends to be I only write when there is the magnetization of this different state of being already within me. And so when I write at all, I tend to write a complete first draft. Now, sometimes those first
Mm,
drafts don't turn into usable poems, and then there might be a line that comes back or an idea that comes back. But the assemblage from smaller parts, I tend to work from the need for the whole, and that summons into it the lines that then feel like gifts. So that is a really good
mm.
question, but it's one you need to ask of somebody who works differently than the way I do.
Great, thank you. Another sort of poetry practice question asked by several people is asking if you could talk about haiku as a practice of falling in love with the natural world.
Haiku and its older sibling tanka, which is 31 syllables rather than 17, so practically an epic. These are fantastic forms because at their heart is an act of observation of the natural world. This is the DNA of Japanese poetic forms, is this looking outward and answering inward, or having an inward emotion and then looking outward for its embodiment. And the secret, I believe, to the practice of haiku is, first of all, just sort of uh, learn what a real haiku is. And a real haiku is not 575. That is, the discipline of the brevity is part of it, but the metrics is not the heart of haiku. The
Mhm.
heart of haiku, and heart of haiku happens to be, should any of you want to do this, one of the chapters in the book 10 Windows is a long chapter about Basho and his development of haiku in the 17th century in Japan. It is also available from, if you don't boycott them, and I understand if you do, it is an Amazon Kindle single. So for 99 cents, you can get The Heart of Haiku as an ebook. The Heart of Haiku is a perception that gives you a discovery, and it is tied to the natural world. So you can find lots of instructions for how to make haiku. You can find lots of haiku in books and online. The secret of writing haiku is don't try to write one, try to write 10, try to write 20. And that will relax you, and you won't be so worried about making the one great discovery, because you will have made 20 discoveries, and some of them will really work and some of them maybe less so. But these are forms which are devoted to noticing something in the world. The thing which keeps haiku particularly tied to the observation of the natural world is the kigo, the season word. So if you are acknowledging the season, which might be, it doesn't have to be autumn dusk, it could be cricket. And if the crickets are singing, it is autumn. If the plum blossom is opening, it is spring. So, these are fantastic forms for getting the feel of what a poem is. Because when you've succeeded in writing one that works, you feel it inside you. It's like eating a chili pepper. There is a bodily experience of the world opening. So I'm sorry, to do justice to this question would have meant another hour.
Yeah, we'll have another program. Thank you. Let's see here. Just folks, I'm sorry, I'm only going to have, we're only going to have time for another one or two questions, and then we'll like to hear another poem or two before we close off. Brenda Patterson says, yes, please send us off with homework. I think this probably came in when you were giving the earlier assignment, so to speak. Do you think your sense of introversion, your introspection came before your turning toward poetry, or was the poetry there all along and deepened your introspection?
Wonderful question. So I was always from earliest childhood, I was always running off to be alone. I was reading a book in my room rather than out at my parents' party. Both ways work for poets. I imagine, Allen Ginsberg was probably out performing his parents' friends when he was 5 years old, just as I was hiding in my room. There's no one way to be a poet. But for me, poems were a private life raft. They were how, in that safety of what for the introvert, what feels like safety is solitude. And in my solitude, I could bring the world into the room with me by writing poems. And so I could be both alone and with all things, all people, my entire experience. And so, I began as the kind of person I was, and poetry was very well suited for that person to develop the courage and the insight and the ability to be with my own experience without fear of other people laughing at me, because after all, you don't have to show anyone your poem. I didn't throughout my whole childhood. I hid them under the mattress, and somehow it never occurred to me that my mother probably found them when she made the bed. I didn't realize that. So yeah.
Great. So I think we have time for just one more question, and then we'll sort of work towards closure, hopefully with another poem or two from you, Jane. So Mara says that poetry and the practice of poems can help us to heal. How have you utilized poems in relation to trauma, personal or ego grief?
Well, yes, the poems. I think when I told you about the genesis of that poem on the fifth day, that's a really clear example of I was undone. I was sputtering with disbelief, incomprehension, and outrage. And the but that's not a condition that does anybody any good. You know, it's like it doesn't serve yourself and it doesn't serve others to be sputtering with outrage. And so because I had poetry to turn to, I could begin to take in what had happened, give music to what had happened, give thought to what had happened, realize that I was not alone in my response to this. And so you have that, you know, stanza near the end of all of the people, you know, the accountants and the machinists and the cellists who also were taking this in with disbelief. And by giving voice to my own experience, it then turned out that that poem was able to serve others and help others and you know, go out into the world and give a vessel for what, if it is not held in a vessel, simply evaporates. You know, water without a cup turns into a puddle on the ground and spills and can't do any work. In a cup, you can answer the thirsts of our very, very thirsty souls.
That's beautiful. Yeah, so it was writing that poem, for example, then was healing for you, just the process of doing it, but then also was able to generate healing worldwide in that case. So,
and you know, how do we know what will heal anybody else except by feeling what restores us to our own sense of. Also, I will just say, you know, in any circumstance, in the worst imaginable circumstance, a person who can write a poem is a person who is reminded of their own agency. You could be in a hospital bed, you can be in a prison cell, you could be stuck in traffic, you are feeling totally helpless. But if you are a person who is connecting word to word and shaping experience and making a discovery, you have all of your agency reminded to you. You are a person who can make a poem. The word poesis, Greek word, it means maker. And if you are a maker, you are not the passive recipient of the blows of this world.
It's empowering. Yeah, wonderful. Well, I think we're nearly out of time. I want to just say a couple closing things and ask you, Jane, to sort of help close us out with a poem or two. And so I don't want to blather after that. So I do want to thank you again, Jane, for making this time to be with us. It's been a wonderful conversation. And thank everyone for joining us tonight. Again, I'll mention that within about 24 hours, a video of this whole thing will be on the Natural History Institute YouTube channel. We encourage you to subscribe to that. And also, I wanted to acknowledge and thank my colleague, Bob Ellis, who, and realize it may be puzzling to people why there's a picture of a guy down the bottom of the screen the whole time. Bob is the program director of the Institute and has been behind the scenes making all this work and linking up the live stream and all that stuff. So that's why you see him there. So again, thank you so much, Jane, and maybe you can take us out with a poem.
Thank you. So I will give you, I will spare you the darkest poem I've ever written, which I could have ended with, but that would be wrong. And I'll take you out with two short poems, one fairly recent, one from the new book, and then one earlier one. I live on the hem of Mount Tamalpais in Northern California. And this is a poem, I wake up every day, I see it out my window, unless it's foggy, and then I know it's there anyhow. But I have a lot of poems that think about the mountain because the mountain is so much part of my life. So this is a poem talking about that relationship between the personal life and the large that we are part of. The last word is a little hard to hear, I realize. So the last word is rennel, and that's wren, the bird, having been turned into an adjective, rennel. Mountainal. This first light mountain its east peak and west peak, its first light creeks, Lagunitas, redwood, fern, their fishes and mosses, its night and day hawk life, slope life, fogs, coyote, tan oaks, white speckled amanita, its spider webs, sequins. To be personal is easy. Wake, slip arms and legs from sleep into name, into story. I wanted to be mountainal, wateral, renal.
Mhm.
And then I will close with a slightly earlier poem, a poem about something I badly needed personally at the time that I wrote it, but was also well aware by then that the biosphere needed it as well. So if you can write a poem about climate change and your own psyche's condition of despair at the same time, that was the spirit with which I was writing this poem. It's called Optimism. More and more I have come to admire resilience, not the simple resistance of a pillow whose foam returns over and over to the same shape, but the sinuous tenacity of a tree. Finding the light newly blocked on one side, it turns in another. A blind intelligence, true, but out of such persistence arose turtles, rivers, mitochondria, figs, all this resinous, unretractable earth. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Tom, Natural History Institute, Bob, and the invisible gathered people who I wish I could all see. And one of these days we will again gather together in person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you, everybody. Good night.